I did not know who the hell Dusty Rhodes was. My first exposure to Dusty Rhodes, transitioning into that now, was when he came over in the 80s in the Hogan and Savage era, at like the height of it, and they threw him the polka dots. And I remember thinking, because we talked about this on Mania WrestleMania when we talked about WrestleMania 5, who's this fat ass wearing polka dots? Why does he have this crackhead black woman who looks like my neighbor with the loud dogs? Why is she there dancing with him? I don't understand any of this. People should look like the Ultimate Warrior, not like
I don't
my
know if
Uncle
y'all can
Louie.
see, but
Yes.
I'm showing y'all the program from the WWF Championship match from September of 1977, September 26th at the Garden, with Dusty challenging Superstar Billy Graham. And yes, this is the actual program that you got at the Garden.
I feel like Dusty versus Superstar Billy Graham is like the structure of every great wrestling match ever. It's always a big fat guy versus a colorfully built guy. It's amazing.
But this is part of one of my dad's scrapbooks from the 70s
Nice.
of all these things that, and again, I'll show you kind of a wide shot of, again, various ticket stubs and programs. And I have about 6 of these things full of, you'll see here Bruno Sammartino versus Bruiser Brody from Madison Square Garden. And yeah.
So that was my first impression of Dusty. And I would learn later that Dusty's great ability was he could turn anything into money. And he was highly relatable. He was the champion of, as WWE would say, the common man. And while even as a kid, I thought his gimmick was ridiculous. He had an appeal that at the time I didn't appreciate, and I do now in retrospect. Gavin, tell me your earliest memories of Dusty Rhodes and what he meant to you then and now.
My earliest memory of Dusty, at least vivid memory, is him walking to the ring at Starrcade with the side of his head shaved and Tully Blanchard's name written in permanent marker above his ear.
That's amazing.
It was one of the first feuds that really jumped out at me because to that point, I watched wrestling and I appreciated the characters, but I hadn't really gotten invested in a storyline. And it was that Dusty Tully storyline that was the first one that I really got invested in.
Okay,
and then from there it was...
Hang on. I got to jump in. Children are going to be watching this and don't know what a Tully Blanchard is or what this Dusty Tully feud was.
He's the Wombat.
So give me a little background here. What was Tully to Dusty? Why were they feuding? Why did this stand out for you?
Tully was Joe Blanchard's son. And I say that not only biologically, but he was, if there was ever a man that was his father's son, Tully Blanchard was Joe Blanchard's son.
Yes, because the lineage is that of an asshole. Let's just call it what it is out there.
And eventually we would get Tessa
and Tully, now in his later years being reformed, being active in a prison ministry, being very open about his relationship with God. He'll tell you he was a bad person. He was not a likable person.
So Ricky Morton.
And he was, he was never going to be a babyface. It's just not who Tully Blanchard was. He might be the most natural heel that's ever existed in professional wrestling.
Okay.
But to his credit, at 5'10", 215 pounds, he could make you believe. He was a smart worker. He knew how to get the best out of his opponents.
Great athlete. Played quarterback at West Texas State in college.
Yeah,
5'7".
Smart guy. And to his credit, at that point, Tully was the only person that went into a singles feud with Dusty Rhodes and came out the other side better off. Everybody else that Dusty feuded with either moved back down the card after Dusty feuded with them, or they were on the same level, such as Dusty and Harley or Dusty and Rick, so there was no danger of another legitimate main eventer getting bumped down. And Tully was one of very few that feuded with Dusty and actually was elevated because of it. And I don't think that's any fault of Dusty's. I think
Was this-
Dusty's star power was just such that it was hard for guys to sustain that with whatever their next program was.
Was this pre-Horseman?
It was right at the beginning.
Okay.
It was kind of at the point where Tully Blanchard Enterprises and the Horsemen were overlapping and starting to come together.
Would it be fair to say that with the success of the Dusty Tully feud is how we get Tully in the Horsemen by hook or by crook? Okay.
Yeah, because everybody hated Dusty. Rick, Arn, Ole, Tully, they all hated Dusty.
Why won't this fat guy go away? What the fuck?
It also did lead to the first ladder match in the United States to ever happen.
It did.
Yep. Okay, hang on one second. Let's go ahead, Pat. Give me 50 words on the very first ladder match, because you hear ladder match now, and somebody listening to this podcast going, wasn't the first ladder match between the Dudleys, the Hardys, and or between Shawn and Razor? So the very first ladder match, you say?
The first ladder match to ever take place in the United States in a major promotion was Dusty and Tully for the television championship in Jim Crockett Promotions.
What year was this?
1985.
Oh, wow. Okay. See that? People think Shawn and Razor invented the ladder match. See, you learn things here on the Whiskey Rebellion.
Very different kind of ladder match where it was just very violent, and it was the objective match as opposed to the how do we use the ladder in a creative way type of match. But
right. So you were talking about your other memories of Dusty there, Gavin, and I'm going to throw it back to Pat.
He from Tully, he went on to the feud with Lex Luger, which really established Lex as a viable upper mid Carter at that point.
If I remember correctly, Lex Luger ain't no cowboy.
He most certainly is not. And Dusty at that point, after the Lex feud, as you get into 88, 89, 90, Dusty's in-ring career starts to wind down, and he becomes the creative genius behind the scenes, the color commentator extraordinaire that so many people know him as.
A bicycle!
A bicycle! Going to the pay window, baby.
He was also the monster that brought us the Shockmaster. I feel like that needs to be said.
Uncle Fred needed some work.
That's Uncle Fred.
But I think if you go back even before the program with Tully, you can find the value in Dusty. Pat brought up that program with Dusty versus superstar Billy Graham. And if there was ever a program that would translate well from, 1979, Pat?
77.
77. From 77 until 2024, those two would still be able to talk the Garden full.
Was Dusty always a heavy guy, like in the kind of shape that we see him in the poster here?
For the most part, he put on weight. He put on weight through the years, but Dusty was also an incredible athlete. He was never blown up in the ring despite his size. There's footage of him playing in charity basketball games and very light on his feet.
That 88 charity basketball game where he's lighting up threes and had some good handle for a big man.
Yeah. And so even then you can go back and you can see that he was more than his appearance would lead you to believe. And in that match at the Garden, you would see the beginnings of what would eventually become Stardust for Cody, because the pattern of Cody's onesie that he wore as Stardust was very much patterned after the robe that Dusty had that night. They didn't give him the floppy painter's hat that Dusty wore. But even going back to the early part of Dusty's career, which is so hard for so many people to imagine, knowing him as this beloved figure now, he and Dick Murdoch are one of the great heel tag teams of all time.
That's right.
The Texas Outlaws were just an unbelievable heel team. They were innovative, and they drew money wherever they went. And from
even
start
when they
to finish,
split,
Dusty was always on top wherever he went, even when they didn't want him to be, like in 1989 in New York. Whatever they gave him, he made it work.
Yeah, that's Dusty's mutant power, is you can give him sand and he'll turn it into gold. Pat, I want you to talk about your memories of Dusty, but I also want you to answer a question for me. Like I said, I was given no parameters. I was told old school wrestling, and I hear old school and I think the 70s because I'm a child. And, there was no wrestling before the 70s. So this is as old as it gets. Anywho, so I literally Googled best wrestlers of the 70s, and the first one that came up was Dusty Rhodes. Why? Why is Dusty considered the best wrestler of the 70s, along with your memories of the man?
For me, I think a lot of people would consider Dusty the best wrestler of the 70s because there's really nobody else who, for that particular decade, had the success level of drawing money on top in so many different territories for the duration of that decade the way he did. Gavin mentioned him in the Texas Outlaws with Dick Murdoch, where they were a hated, vile heel tag team, but drew a ton of money together working Bruiser and Crusher in the AWA and going down to Texas where they were, originally from, and drawing money there by being the hated local guys. They went to Japan
Who they
frequently
draw with the
together.
Funks?
What's that?
Who they draw with the Funks?
In Texas, they drew with whoever they worked with. They did work with Fritz and several
Mhm.
partners a lot in the
Okay.
Dallas territory. But yeah, they drew money together pretty much everywhere they went. And then finally, at a certain point, Dusty just couldn't handle living with Dickie anymore. And they went their separate ways. And Dusty found himself in Florida, and he was working as a single in 1973 in Florida. And at first, is still one of the hated heels, Dirty Dusty Rhodes, not the drink, Dirty Dusty Rhodes.
Mhm.
And was managed by the hated Gary Hart and teaming with this evil foreigner, Pak Song Nam from Korea, with Korean War, rhetoric still fresh in our minds because it wasn't that long before this. And then all of a sudden, he turned on Hart and Pak Song to help the Grams, and the American Dream was born. And just his verbiage, his charisma, the ability to connect with audiences got him so over in Florida that it translated to him working other territories, initially in the South. But those who were watching wrestling in the 70s know that also Vince McMahon Sr. was smart enough to hook Eddie Graham, his buddy, up with a TV package with the Spanish station in New York. So channel 47 WNJU, which is now known as Telemundo, would air on Wednesday nights 1 hour of championship wrestling from Florida, which was the same show you got in the Tampa area. And so the viewers there, if you come across it, you'd be smart. And people like seeing Dusty on that show so much that they brought him to New York to headline against Billy Graham. And he had worked with Billy in the AWA, so there was a chemistry there. And literally, no matter where Dusty went in the 70s, he found himself on top in a program drawing money. And
when does the most famous him and Flair, like that heated rivalry for the NWA
not till the
title
80s.
happen? Okay, that's what I thought. Which is also when the Hard Times promo happens is the 80s, right?
Yeah, that's 86. But Dusty and Flair were kind of squaring off initially as early as 81 when Flair won his first NWA title from Dusty.
Okay.
Dusty's rivalries in the 70s, as far as a singles, really were more with the likes of an early rivalry with Pak Song Nam, like we talked about, who he turned against with Gary Hart and Gary Hart's Army in Florida. He was wrestling guys pretty often like Bobby Duncombe, Joe's LeDuc, all these kind of mercenaries for hire in Florida. He feuded with Terry Funk, obviously, that started in the 70s and would go on for the remainder of their careers. In New York, the AWA, he feuded with Billy Graham. He teamed with Billy Graham in the AWA, too, with Graham as a babyface. He had several matches in Houston with Ivan Koloff, which were legendary. Dusty worked with kind of almost every top heel of the time, essentially. And again, going back to why do people consider him the predominant wrestler of the 70s, all these reasons point to why. And yet my first memories of him are him singing Johnny Be Good on Primetime Wrestling and a sing off with the Honky Tonk Man. But I also remember him taking the spike in the eye from Road Warrior Animal on TBS.
I wanted to talk about that. That's
Yeah.
the infamous spike. Didn't that almost get him kicked off at TBS?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, here we have this great gimmick. Hear me out on this. I'm gonna get stabbed in the eye.
They just gonna try blinding, baby. See, and that's the beauty of it, because the violence for the sake of violence, an eye for an eye, if you will.
Did he ever work with Hogan or Bockwinkel or Giant?
He worked a lot with Nick.
Yeah.
He teamed a lot with Andre,
especially in Mid-South.
Yeah, that was a very popular duo to have at the Superdome shows, where it would be like Andre and Dusty against the Samoans, or Andre and Dusty against, say, Dick Murdoch and Killer Carl Cox, or any combination at the time. But Andre and Dusty were very frequent tag team partners, whether it was Mid-South. If Dusty was getting outnumbered in Florida, he would call on the Giant to back him up. Dusty and Hogan really was never a real program. I believe, Gavin, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, they did cross paths in Japan in tag team matches against each other.
Yeah, that's, as far as I know, that was really the only time that they had any significant interaction until Dusty joined the NWO.
Yeah, Dusty, I believe, was teaming with Inoki against Hogan and Stan Hansen, if I remember correctly.
That sounds right.
Okay. I'm now picturing, you mentioned Dusty being in Mid-South, and I'm picturing dueling promos of Dusty and the Junkyard Dog and a very confused audience. All right.